Welcome to the second and final day of the joint conference organized by the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities and the Hungarian Academy of Sciences to commemorate the great scholar of Islam, Ignaz Goldziher. Yesterday's lectures dealt with Goldziher's contributions to Quranic studies, theological hadith, the ulum al-awail, and Islamic sciences and philosophy, as well as with his observations on the cult of ancestors and the cult of the dead. As we could learn from these lectures, despite the great progress achieved in the century since Goldziher's death, it is astounding how much of his work remains fresh and relevant. Today's lectures promise to shed light on further aspects of Goldziher's oeuvre. There will be 3 speakers, and there should be time left for questions at the end of each talk. Our first speaker this morning is Professor Adam Silverstein, the Max Schlesinger Professor of Islamic Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Silverstein studied Arabic and Persian at the University of Cambridge and held positions at the Universities of Cambridge, Oxford, and King's College London before coming to Israel in 2012. Professor Silverstein specializes in the history of the Middle East from late antiquities to the Middle Ages. Most of his research is comparative, focusing on Islamic cultures within broad historical contexts. His publications bear witness to the broad range of his interests. These publications include Postal Systems in the Pre-Modern Islamic World, Islamic History, a very short introduction, and Veiling Esther, Unveiling Her Story, the reception of a biblical book in Islamic cultures. Professor Silverstein will speak about Muruwwa and Deen 1 century later. Please.
Thank you, Eitan. And first I wish to thank the organizers for inviting me to this important conference. I would like to begin by quoting a well-known hadith about what one leaves behind in this world. When a man dies, his acts come to an end, except for 3 things by which he lives on: recurring charity, knowledge by which people benefit, or a pious son who prays for him. I do not know whether Goldziher established a waqf, nor can I say anything of consequence about his sons, so I will limit myself here to a respectful examination of the knowledge that he left behind, specifically in his seminal chapter, Muruwwa and Deen, and ask whether it contains knowledge by which people benefit even a century after his death. Naturally, in the 140 years that have passed since the chapter was published in Muslim Studies, scholarship has progressed on many fronts, with the result that some of the arguments and points raised in the chapter may now be deemed obsolete. In fact, Goldziher himself admitted at the time of the chapter's publication that it was already in need of updating, as recent books by William Robertson Smith and Julius Wellhausen had been published after Muslim Studies had gone into press, and their findings cannot be incorporated in his chapter. More significant in this post-Orientalism world is the possibility that Goldziher's oeuvre in its entirety may be deemed obsolete. Hamid Dabashi has already treated the question of Goldziher and Orientalism, which is just the excuse I need to be able to say that I won't. For what it's worth, in a few short sentences, I would simply say that as a Jew who is more often than not on the receiving end of prejudice and debilitated in practical ways by his religio-ethnic identity, and as an incorrigible admirer of Islam and its ways, and there are famous quotes on the matter, it seems that Goldziher was anything but the sort of Orientalist that Said took to task in his book. Rather than denigrating Islam to empower his own tradition, Goldziher judged Islam favorably and used it to denigrate Judaism. Thus, while the current climate of cancel culture seems to hold past figures to present standards, I think that in Goldziher's case, this would be particularly unfair. Dabashi ends his lengthy appreciation of Muslim studies with a passage that is replete with backhanded compliments. In his words, "Reading the magnificent essays of Goldziher today is like a walk through a museum of exquisite antiquities, of dead and outdated elegance, the solid thoughts and graceful reflections of a noble man full of graceful sensibilities in his scholarship, beset by the brightest blindness and shining with the darkest insights." Is Dabashi's verdict accurate? Are Goldziher's writings artifacts of an ancient, irrelevant world, interesting to us for their historical curiosity, but otherwise characterized by elegance that is dead and outdated, by insights that are dark, and by bright blindness, we will see that, at least in the case of Muruwwa and Din, Goldziher's ideas have endured and have served as the basis for subsequent generations of scholars who chose to build on his ideas rather than refute them. Precisely because Goldziher's ideas are not dead and still wield influence on the field, it is important to examine them critically and, where needed, to propose ways in which they could be updated. Towards this aim, I will divide my presentation into 3 sections. First, I survey some of the scholarly attention devoted directly to Muruwwa and Din since its publication. Second, I consider some of the results of scholarship over the past 140 years that indirectly bear upon Goldziher's ideas in the chapter. And finally, I consider not what Goldziher did cover in his chapter, but rather an important idea that he chose not to discuss, despite its imminent relevance. Before proceeding, it's worth recapping the basic argument of the Muruwwa and Din essay in Goldziher's own words. The gulf between the moral views of the Arabs and the Prophet's ethical teachings is deep and unbridgeable. If we seek slogans to make the contrast clear, we can find none better than the 2 words Din and Muruwwa. The first is the religion of Muhammad. The second, the virtue, literally and etymologically, the Latin word virtus corresponds to the Arabic Muruwwa, of the Arabs. In this statement, Goldziher makes 3 assertions: that there is a deep and unbridgeable gulf between the Arabs' moral system and Islam, that the best terms for expressing the 2 sides of the divide are Muruwwa and Din, and that Muruwwa bears comparison, both literally and conceptually, with the Latin virtus. In what follows, I will test each of these assertions in the light of subsequent research, beginning with those studies that have engaged with Goldziher's ideas directly. One of the first scholars to do so was Bishr Faris, whose thoughts on the subject appeared in a 1932 book on honor amongst the pre-Islamic Arabs, and then in the entry on Muruwwa in the Encyclopedia of Islam, thereby giving his ideas both authority and influence. Faris disagreed with Goldziher's categorization of Muruwwa as being primarily an ethical concept, arguing instead that it related to material conditions of life. In 1946, Meir Bravman published a Hebrew article in which he forcefully refuted Faris's arguments, agreeing with Goldziher that Muruwwa was a moral spiritual concept, but disagreeing with him on the dynamics of the contrast between Muruwwa and Din. For Bravman, the rise of Islam does not represent the turning point that Goldziher imagined. Skipping ahead to 1974, Marshall Hodgson adopted Goldziher's moral dichotomy, but, as he often did, Hodgson offered alternative terminology to reflect the 2 worldviews. For him, the pre-Islamic ethos reflected an ingratitude stemming from a refusal to recognize God. Hodgson calls this kufr, whereas Islam demanded trust in and faithfulness to God, or iman. Later in the 1970s, John Wansbrough published his Quranic Studies, in which, amongst other things, he agreed with Goldziher's distinction between 2 competing worldviews and the relevance of the Latin virtus for understanding Muruwwa. However, for Wansbrough, the rise of Islam is not a turning point in the relationship between Arabians and Islamic ethical systems. In his words, neither Muruwwa nor Din exhibits a chronological line of demarcation between Islam and Jahiliyyah. Bedouin rejection of religious prescriptions represents, after all, a constant in Islamic history and can more profitably be interpreted as a reflex of social, economic, even regional dichotomies, and chronologically unlimited. In 1983, Charles Pellat published an article on the concept of Muruwwa in Jahili times, in which he argued that the notion was far more complex than Goldziher's treatment of it suggests. I will return later to the plasticity of the term, but will simply note here, generally speaking, that Pellat was fine-tuning Goldziher's ideas rather than arguing against them. Along these lines, in 1986, James Montgomery published what is perhaps the most significant treatment of Muruwwa since Goldziher's time. His article offers a particularly sharp and nuanced analysis of the relationship, or total equivalence, between Jahili poetry and Muruwwa. Crucially, Montgomery's evidence and analyses strengthen Goldziher's arguments rather than challenging or reassessing them. The importance of Montgomery's study comes not only from its ideas, but from the fact that it became something of a new standard in subsequent works dealing with the concept of Muruwwa. In recent years, highly original studies by Bauer, Pökel, and Neuwirth have taken the field forward and no longer engage directly with Goldziher's arguments, implicitly accepting them through engagement with Montgomery, who himself took Goldziher as a starting point. This is not to say that Muruwwa and Din has been forgotten, and one still finds quotations of it and references to it in the literature. Perhaps no less important than those studies that engage directly with Muruwwa and Din are those that treat topics of direct relevance to his theories and which therefore affect the currency of Goldziher's ideas. I will begin my survey with our understanding of Din. Unsurprisingly, much of the attention paid to the Muruwwa and Din equation has focused on its Muruwwa half, the assumption being that Din is Islam, and we all know what that is. Here, too, it is worth dwelling, even if only temporarily, on how our understanding of deen has developed since Goldziher's time. The Quran and early Islamic sources generally actually use two homonyms when referring to deen. It is not merely that the words are distinct, but that they are from entirely different language families and reflect different semantic fields that overlap enough to have caused the conflation of these two words into a single deen. One of the words is Semitic, meaning judgment or law. The other is Indo-Iranian and refers to religion. The Quran itself deploys deen in both ways, and while religion is by far better represented, it is not insignificant that the phrase Yawm ad-Din, with the meaning of the day of judgment, appears in the Fatiha and is very much part of the very basic vocabulary of Islam. Why does this matter? Well, if the Jahili Arabs were understanding deen in the Semitic rather than in the Indo-Iranian sense, they would be forgiven for expecting their application of the Prophet's new rules would lead to material consequences rather than some spiritual rewards. This is, after all, how Near Eastern systems of justice worked since the times of Hammurabi, some 2,500 years before the rise of the Prophet's own deen. Moreover, the ambiguous nature of the word deen, even in the Quran itself, makes us wonder whether Goldziher actually chose the right word here to represent the opposite of Muruwwa. In fact, Pokul, following Izutsu, opts for taqwa, while Hodgson, reflecting perhaps his Christian perspective, suggests iman, as we have seen. I'll return to taqwa later in this paper. Scholarship on the concept of Islam as a religion and as an all-encompassing civilization has come a long way since Goldziher's time. Working backwards, Shahab Ahmad's posthumously published What is Islam? Shows us that our conceptions of Islam require some serious fine-tuning. I will not dwell on his wide-ranging ideas other than to point out a central feature of his argument, and one reflected on the book's cover illustration, namely that Islam and wine drinking were far less incompatible than we are meant to believe. Wine drinking was one of the characteristic features of Goldziher's Muruwwa, and I will return to it later. No less important is Cronin Heinz's pioneering book, God's Caliph, which has forced us to reconsider our definition of Islam in the pre-Abbasid or pre-Mihna period. According to their thesis, what Goldziher would define as deen is actually the version of Islam that emerged triumphant from amongst a selection of competing interpretations of the religion. Hisham's palace displays elaborate scenes of wine drinking and licentiousness, another feature of Goldziher's Muruwwa, not because the Umayyads were un-Islamic, but rather because they could deem such behavior to be Islam. This is doubly relevant to us for the simple reason that the Umayyads, as the interpreters of deen, were routinely described as being the purveyors of traditional Arabian cultural values. Muawiyah, we are told, was possessed of hilm. He ruled through receiving wufud of ashraf, and he sought to exact vengeance for Uthman, not as a ruler establishing justice within his realms, but as Uthman's kinsman out for revenge. The term thar, tribal revenge, is specifically used in the sources. One might also add the Umayyads' insistence on wala to an Arab tribe for non-Arabs seeking to convert to Islam, amongst other things. And although it is an altogether more complex topic, the reconfiguration of the conquerors and their descendants into Qais and Yaman supertribes demonstrates that the language of Jahili societal organization was still being spoken. With particular reference to Goldziher's conceptions of Muruwwa, it is noteworthy that Neuwirth argued that the Umayyads sought to link social prestige with genealogy, nasab, whereas the Kharijites argued for piety or taqwa, and during their reign, the Umayyad conception dominated, thereby perpetuating one of the key characteristics of Muruwwa by Goldziher's reckoning. Indeed, Goldziher seems to have been aware of this, stating that in Umayyad period, the Arab instincts, with all their heathen immediacy, survived more or less intact. Thus, in the light of the God's Caliph thesis, we must consider seriously the possibility that in the Umayyad period, Muruwwa and deen were, by definition, one and the same. Goldziher's conceptions of Muruwwa and the society in which it developed may also require some rethinking in light of subsequent scholarship on pre-Islamic Arabia. At the very outset of his chapter, Goldziher consciously distinguishes between South Arabia and the world of the Hijaz, and it is in the latter where, in his view, the Muruwwa and deen tension is in evidence. In recent decades, however, scholars such as Brown, Bowersock, Conrad, Fowden, Hoyland, Retzo, and others have demonstrated the importance of bringing South Arabia into the picture. I will not dwell on the details here, but simply wish to point out that the stage on which Goldziher's Muruwwa plays out has been expanded considerably. Even if we are to limit ourselves to the Hijaz, we find that scholarship has gone some way towards reassessing the extent to which this region really was empty. While Montgomery's article, The Empty Hijaz, argues this point most directly and forcefully, a considerable number of other scholars have reinforced the point from different angles. To cite but one example, Michael MacDonald describes the pervasiveness of literacy in the Jahiliyyah as follows. Literacy seems to have been extraordinarily widespread, not only among the settled populations, but also among the nomads. Indeed, the scores of thousands of graffiti on the rocks of the Syro-Arabian desert suggest that it must have been almost universal amongst the latter. By the Roman period, it is probable that a higher proportion of the population in this region was functionally literate than in any other area of the ancient world. Another aspect of the Muruwwa half of the equation that has evolved since Goldziher's day pertains to the reliance on Jahili poetry in constructing our picture of Muruwwa values. Nearly a half-century after Muslim studies was published, Taha Hussein and David Margoliouth cast doubt on the authenticity of this corpus of poetry. Even granting that a large proportion of the poetry does originate in the Jahiliyyah, which is a reasonable assumption, Drury, amongst others, has illuminated the importance of early Abbasid caliphs in salvaging, presenting, and eventually shaping these materials. To the extent that our picture of Muruwwa is almost entirely based on the poetic record, we must accept that these materials are not without their limitations. On a related note, studies such as those conducted by Jacobi and others on the Muhadramun poets demonstrate how neatly their pre- and post-Islamic poems reflect the transition between Jahili culture and Islam, or between Muruwwa and Deen. But this neatness belies the fact that such transitions are necessarily gradual and anything but neat. In other words, by relying on poetry, we may be dealing with an illusion of the source materials, rather than a reality on which to base historical analysis. The poetic record may indeed reflect the sort of dichotomy between Muruwwa and Deen for which Goldziher argued, but it may well be that this record does not reflect the realities of life on the ground. I will return to Jahili poetry shortly when considering Neuwirth's ideas on the relationship between the Quran and its Arabian context. One aspect of Muruwwa that has benefited from scholarly attention is the term's plasticity, as mentioned earlier. It is simply untenable to imply that Muruwwa was a fixed idea whose resonances were generally agreed upon and whose package of values could either be accepted or rejected wholesale. Rather, the term was a dynamic one, which could and did undergo reinterpretation when deployed after the rise of Islam. For instance, in a recent unpublished paper, Marino charts the evolving usages of the term Muruwwa until the 16th century, arguing, and I quote, that this semantic uncertainty arises not only from the vagueness of Muruwwa's definition, but also from the lack of consistency in its usage, end of quote. To cite but one example of this, Marino devotes an important attention to the Sufis' re-semantization of the term within the context of their mystical ethics. Goldziher himself was aware of the famous saying, La din bila Muruwwa, or La din illa bi Muruwwa, a saying that he recognized was meant to acculturate aspects of Jahili values within Islam, rather than distinguishing sharply between the two. Accordingly, Muruwwa can mean little more than laudable conduct. Moreover, even when relating this conduct to masculinity in some way, Izutsu has shown that concepts of virtuous masculinity shift between cultures. To round out this somewhat rushed survey, it is worth recalling that a series of hyper-skeptical studies have appeared in recent decades whose findings, should they be accepted, would do such comprehensive damage to our preconceptions about both Muruwwa and Deen that they would confine Goldziher's thesis to the Mansukh pile altogether. Peter Webb has argued that what we deem to be Arab is a concept that only emerged after the conquests in the mid to late 7th century. Wansborough argued that what we deem to be Islam similarly only emerged long after the conquerors spread throughout the Near East. Krona and Cook argue that the entire internal record on which Goldziher based his ideas about both Muruwwa and Deen are hopelessly unreliable and biased. And Horting argued that the worlds of pagan Muruwwa and monotheistic Deen, so carefully contrasted in the poetic and historical records, were actually one and the same, as the shirk culture of the pagan Hijaz was itself merely monotheism of an imperfect sort. And yet, for whatever reasons, these theories have not on the whole managed to make the transition from the margins of scholarship to its mainstream. Goldziher, by contrast, continues to be read and his chapter's legacy felt. Montgomery refers to Goldziher's chapter as the best definition of Muruwwa, while later scholars such as Neuwirth, Poikel, and Bauer continue where Montgomery left off, contributing to an isnad of which Goldziher's work is the first link. And based on this illustrious isnad, Goldziher's chapter is sahih. But Goldziher would have wanted us to focus on the matan too, which is what I will now do. In this section, I will engage critically with Goldziher's chapter, focusing on those characteristics of Muruwwa that Goldziher deemed inimical to Deen. Before zeroing in on specific examples, it is worth mentioning that even the general atmosphere of fatalism, which Goldziher saw as characterizing the world of Muruwwa, endured into Islamic times, when it was naturalized. As the saying goes, al-maktub mafish minhu mahrub, that which is decreed cannot be fleed. I know it's bad English, but it's also bad Arabic. Between such notions as qadr and kismet, the topic of fate versus free will has long occupied Muslim scholars. I'm not spoiling some surprise by revealing that, in a sentence, the near consensus is that God, rather than man, controls fate. In other words, for all the difference in terminology, there is essentially little difference between Muruwwa and Deen on this issue. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. As for specific examples of the essential differences between Muruwwa and Deen, I begin with vengeance. For Goldziher, Islam preached a far-reaching reform in this field of human emotion. As the Prophet told the Meccans who adhered to, in his words, a cult of revenge, that forgiveness was no weakness but a virtue. The question is, does the abandonment of vengeance have to do with the adoption of Deen, or with the establishment of state structures in a region that was previously devoid of them? Clearly, there is every reason for vengeance to play a role in tribal society, such as the pre-Islamic Hijaz. After all, consistent with the stress on justice and equity, vengeance, or more precisely, retribution of any sort, is the only way to guarantee safety and some sort of intertribal order. Moreover, the other aspect of retribution is deterrence. In a tribal, nomadic, or semi-nomadic society, there is neither police force nor established justice system. What keeps people in line is the knowledge that no deed goes unanswered. With the establishment of an Islamic legal system and military, reflected in the Constitution of Medina, but also in the Quran, vengeance and retribution become unnecessary. The point is not that the Arabs had certain ethical values and Islam created a tension between Allah's demands and Muruwwa, but rather that the needs of Arabia's inhabitants changed. Moreover, perhaps more problematic for Goldziher's adducing of vengeance to illustrate the ethical gulf between Muruwwa and Deen is the fact that there is vengeance, even of the petty schoolyard variety, in Deen too. One need look no further than the qisas, or retaliation in kind punishments, mentioned in the Quran. The eye for an eye idea, as old as Hammurabi, and of course biblical too, was widely known, and lex talionis, reciprocal justice, was an idea common to both societies characterized by Muruwwa and to those characterized by Deen. Another attribute of Muruwwa that, in Goldziher's view, was eradicated by Deen is the appeal to the prestige of one's lineage or ancestors. In his words, amongst the causes of self-congratulation amongst the Arabs, the fame of ancestors is the foremost. Not only were one's ancestors a source of pride, but virtues and vices being passed on from one's ancestors, the individual could prove his Muruwwa best by being able to point out that the virtues which make the true Muruwwa were transmitted from noble ancestors. The Islamic ethical system, as far as Goldziher is concerned, put an end to this tribalism and attributed prestige on the basis of spiritual credentials rather than one's illustrious tribal ties, or hasab. Islam's egalitarianism has been championed throughout history, beginning with the Kharijite insistence that even an Abyssinian slave could be caliph. And yet, we all know that the Kharijite egalitarians did not win the day. Sunni political theory still insists on a caliph's Qurashi pedigree, and the various Shia branches limit the holy lineage even further. The Quran itself stresses that God has chosen a particular family line of prophecy, referring repeatedly to the dhurriya of certain prophets, and even to their fathers, their descendants, and their brothers. Moreover, the Quran tells us that on his deathbed, Jacob asked his sons what they will worship once he has died, to which they replied, "We will worship your God and the God of your fathers, Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac." Finally, Muhammad's status as the seal of prophets, by definition, highlights his own hasab, albeit as the heir to a prophetic rather than a tribal lineage. Lineage and ancestral claims of various sorts were enshrined in Deen too. Even setting aside such uniquely blessed figures as prophets, Sunni caliphs, and Shia imams, amongst ordinary Muslims, the concept of sunnah in the earliest generations of Islam applied not only to the Prophet, but also to the Sahaba, and of course Salafis throughout history have extended the cultural religious prestige of the community's forefathers to the 3 generations following the Prophet. Even Ibn Taymiyyah, when discussing the permissibility of visiting graves, suggests that the customs of his forefathers held weight and authority for him. What is worth stressing, however, is that with the advent of deen, the ancestor or tribal ties to which we are referring became spiritualized. As the famous verse states, indeed the believers are but brothers. Just as Jesus in the New Testament no less famously stated, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. The spiritualization of the family tribal bonds at one and the same time devalues the concept of lineage by canceling it categorically, while confirming nonetheless that the deepest bonds are to be expressed in familiar or tribal terms. The spiritualization of Muruwwa concepts is also relevant to the next two characteristic examples of Muruwwa behaviors supposedly at odds with deen, namely wine and women. Goldziher argues that Jahili poetry reflects a drinking culture and licentiousness that Islam then outlawed. While it is true that the prohibition on alcohol consumption is probably second only to the prohibition of pork as a symbol of Islamic legal restrictions, and that the Quran provides a disproportionately detailed list of regulations concerning the laws of marriage, it would be a gross oversimplification to suggest that deen forbade that which Muruwwa allowed in these two cases. Beginning with wine, although the Quran had unequivocal ways of declaring certain things forbidden, phrases such as "hurrimat alaykum" come to mind, this language is never used regarding wine consumption. In one case, we are told regarding gambling and wine that in them there is great sin, but also some benefit, but the sin is greater than the benefit. This is hardly an unambiguous condemnation. Elsewhere, we are told that wine is but defilement, rijis, and the work of the Satan, so ignore it so that you may be successful. The latter verse sounds like excellent advice, but not an outright prohibition. As for licentiousness, strictures concerning women and marriage are common in most religious moral systems, and it is not a distinguishing character of deen to have established some red lines. Indeed, many a pagan Muruwwa-based society would frown upon the sort of, probably exaggerated, licentiousness that is described in the poetry. Moreover, it is worth bearing in mind that for observers in the pre-modern Christian world, Islam and the Prophet Muhammad specifically were routinely criticized for being licentious. Abstinence, which would indeed be a complete contrast to Muruwwa womanizing, simply is not a feature by deen by any stretch. Perhaps more importantly, however, is the fact that unlike other aspects of Islam that are widely believed to be antithetical to religion, wine and women are actually deemed to be positive in Islamic thought. But there is a catch. You will enjoy these things later on, and only on the condition that you behave in the meantime. In other words, wine and women are promised to believers in paradise, rather than being deemed negative in their very essence. One of the rivers flowing in paradise will be flowing with wine, delicious for the drinkers, and cups of white and delicious wine will be circulated among the drinkers, while 72 virgins await those who have been admitted to Jannah. Just to clarify, that is 68 more wives than deen allows. It is not simply the case that paradise is where all that was bad is now good. Nowhere are we told that by refraining from idolatry in this world, we will be able to pray to Allat, Manat, and Al-Uzza in the hereafter. And I do not recall a tradition stating that heavenly Meiser games and feasts of pork await the righteous. But wine and women are not all bad in the eyes of deen. Rather, they are not for now, and one has to earn them. It is odd, therefore, that Goldziher chose wine and women as his leading examples of antitheses to Islam. In fact, understanding the spiritualization of Muruwwa and the introduction of afterlife to the worldview also helps us understand the rejection of vengeance discussed earlier. It is not just that the new justice system and military organization obviated the need for vengeance, but that the introduction of both individual, temporal reward and punishment and otherworldly reward and punishment changed the rules of the game completely. These ideas creep into the Hebrew Bible only towards the very end, and are only fully naturalized within both Judaism and Christianity during late antiquity. Thus, by the time the Quran was revealed, we knew that one can forgive a criminal without foregoing justice, as the evildoers will receive their comeuppance in the hereafter, or perhaps even in this world, with God executing the justice at a time and place of his choosing. The real ethical revolution here was in the transition from a society of just deserts to one of just desserts. These ideas are related to a broader point about the relationship between Jahili culture and the Quran. Horovitz argued that the Quran intentionally inverts the pagan worldview, and Izutsu focused on a selection of pagan concepts such as generosity, courage, patience, loyalty, and so forth that were consciously Islamicized. To cite but one example of this, the Muruwwa vice of extravagant generosity was reined in and acculturated within deen as almsgiving. I do not wish to sound overly picky, but does the transition from unfettered over-generosity, Muruwwa, to institutionalized generosity, deen, really represent a cultural paradigm shift? Neuwirth has adduced similar examples of this. The Dhikr al-Atlal, morose reflections on deserted encampments of Jahili poetry, become the cautionary tales of the past unbelieving nations and their desolate settlements. Moreover, while the Jahili version of the idea is pessimistic, the Quranic version, in stressing the fate of unbelievers, actually informs its audience that there is a way of avoiding this fate. Along these lines, Thomas Bauer has argued for what he calls negative intertextuality between the Jahili poetry and the Quran, where the latter consciously subverts accepted literary conventions in a stylistic version of the Horowitz idea about the Quran's inversion of the pagan worldview. To summarize, the worlds of Muruwwa and Deen are not separated by what Goldziher called a deep and unbridgeable gulf at all. In fact, they are in conversation with each other, arguing, no doubt, but agreeing on the general topics under discussion and the language used to express the ideas. For this reason, Neuwirth has argued that the Jahili poetry is to be considered as much an intertext of the Quran as the Judeo-Christian scriptures are. I would like to end this critical survey with a point about the general assumption that underpins Goldziher's entire thesis, namely that Muruwwa, of the sort described in his chapter, and Deen cannot happily coexist. In fact, as Goldziher was surely aware, almost every aspect of the Muruwwa ethical system that he deemed incompatible with Deen endured in Judaism alongside it. As is well known, late 19th and early 20th century biblicists, seeking to understand better the world of the biblical Israelites, turned to contemporary Arabian societies, which were seen as having preserved the Arabian tribal ethos authentically enough to be of relevance to a reconstruction of pre-exilic Judaism. Whether or not this methodology was sound, it assumed that the Israelites were culturally possessed of Muruwwa and theologically possessed of Deen. As early as the 15th century, European painters portrayed biblical characters as wearing keffiyehs, a trend that one finds everywhere from Rembrandt's paintings to children's books of Bible stories. Ancient Judaism preserves an attachment to ancestral ties of the physical, genetic sort, and the idea that reward and punishment can be this worldly, rains, droughts, exile, and so forth, as well as otherworldly, also occurs. This latter point is relevant both because Goldziher's Jahili Arabs expected this worldly rewards, and because the Quran itself mixes both types of reckoning. For while the promise of heaven and hell and the threat of hell dominate the Quranic discourse, the various punishment stories indicate that God can mete out justice in this world, just as the repeated phrase, وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِيَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, expresses a similar concept for those who do good. And of course, the Bible's leading characters took multiple wives and mistresses and drank wine, while God praised the nomadic Rechabites for steadfastly sticking to the customs of their ancestors, while chastising the Israelites for failing to do so. It is not just in ancient Judaism that we find Muruwwa and Deen coexisting, but in late antiquity and the Middle Ages too. The compatibility between the two notions is well in evidence. In the pre-Islamic period, as Stillman has pointed out, Jews were no less purveyors of Muruwwa than pagans were, and he cites the poet Samawal ibn Adiyah as a case in point. Similarly, the Geniza documents, which admittedly Goldziher could not yet use, portray society in which the specific terms Muruwwa and Deen and the concepts to which they related in pre-Islamic times feature side by side. As Goldziher stated regarding the Geniza's Muruwwa, the original meaning was still underlining its usage in Geniza times. It designates the totality of the mundane natural virtues as opposed to, or rather complementary to, those acquired by the educational influence of religion described as Deen. Strikingly, Goldziher then continues thus. Even a fledgling student of Islam knows that the opening chapter of Mohammedan studies by Ignaz Goldziher, the father of Islamology, is entitled Muruwwa and Deen. The Geniza letters show that the awareness of virtues outside of and alongside with the spheres of religion was a mark of the medieval civilization of the Near East as revealed in the day-to-day life of a minority group. Compared with the ethical world of Talmudic Judaism or of the Jews in medieval Western Europe, this dichotomy is remarkable. Thus, the Jewish evidence shows that Muruwwa continued to exist as a category separate from Deen and complementary to it, rather than being internalized within it as happened in Islamic contexts. We are left wondering two things. First, does the sort of dichotomy that underpins Goldziher's thesis necessarily exist? And second, are we to suppose that Goldziher was not aware of the Jewish materials which I have just mentioned? Granted, he could not have known that the Geniza letters nonchalantly speak of Deen and Muruwwa as complementary ethical systems. But what about the ancient Jewish materials? I will touch upon these questions in the time that remains. The third of three assumptions that Goldziher makes in his chapter is that the concept of Muruwwa is equivalent to, perhaps even a calque on, the Roman concept of virtus. In fairness to Goldziher, he made the equation of Muruwwa with virtus somewhat in passing. And yet, the idea circulated widely becomes something of an idée fixe in the field. Thus, in what follows, I will humbly and ever so respectfully attempt to break the chain of taqlid, by arguing that Goldziher's adducing of Roman virtus as a comparative framework was a grand feat of misdirection, in which he focused our gaze on the wrong places for personal, or, dare I say it, psychological reasons. Along the way, I will suggest an alternative comparative framework for our understanding of Muruwwa, one that was surely more familiar to Goldziher, to Goitein, and to the inhabitants of Jahili Arabia. Simply put, in my view, there was a much closer parallel to the Muruwwa than virtus, namely the Bible's polemic against givura, vaguely rendered manly heroism or might. Turning to ancient Judaism to elucidate aspects of the Jahili culture and society is particularly justifiable in light of Franz Rosenthal's brilliant point that the notion of Jahiliyyah itself is to be illuminated with recourse to the Jewish concept of galut, exile, a concept that is loaded with associations of moral, spiritual, and cultural corruptness and goes well beyond the existence of a nation outside of their land. If Jahiliyyah was a sort of double entendre of Arabian Jewish relevance, then one must assume that those who use this term had Jewish terminology and ideas in mind. What then, if anything, does ancient Judaism have to say about pagan manliness? The answer is an awful lot, provided one knows where to look. In a nutshell, my argument here is that the Hebrew Bible engaged in a sustained polemic against an approach to life represented by the term gevurah and personified by those called giborim. Behind this polemic is the idea that God himself is the Gibor, and those who arrogate this status to themselves are at best competing with God and at worst denying him altogether. Related to this is the Bible's repeated exhortation to its Israelite audience to rely on God rather than on those who appear mighty and impressive, and to trust that God can and will defeat those with pretensions to gevurah. Interestingly, more than any other nation or culture, it is the Edomites who are singled out as the representatives of this illegitimate gevurah, and against whom the Bible's polemic is aimed. Furthermore, in describing the Edomite Gibors, the Bible reverts to a language and concepts familiar to us from Goldziher's descriptions of Muruwwa. Finally, there is even evidence that the Quran was aware of the anti-Gibor polemic and adopted it too. Before laying out the evidence for these assertions, it is important to make 2 points about the word gevurah or gibor. First, the root gabara has a semantic field that is almost identical to that represented by mara'a, and this is not a mere curiosity of etymology. As Winkler has recently shown, the Bible ridicules and polemicizes against its traditional others by demasculinizing them and portraying them as failed men. Second, in taking Winkler's arguments forward, one finds such biblical demasculization directed against foreign gibors. In one case, an anti-Babylonian prophecy in Jeremiah states, "The mighty men, Giborim of Babylon, have forborne to fight. They remain in their strongholds. Their might, Gvuratam, has failed. They have become like women." In another case, an anti-Edomite prophecy in Jeremiah predicts, behold, she shall come and swoop down as the vulture, and spread out his wings against Botzra. And the heart of the mighty men, Giborim of Edom, at that day shall be as the heart of a woman in her pangs. Thus, gevurah is in no way inferior to virtus as a calque for particularly masculine virtues. The Bible's polemic against gibors is in evidence already in Genesis, where the term is introduced immediately before and after the story of Noah's flood. Preceding the flood, the Bible explains that the sons of God were attracted to the daughters of man and took them as wives. From this coupling emerged the Nephilim, who are described as the Giborim of ancient times, the men of renown. Crucially, the Bible then explains that the world was so permeated with evil that God decided to destroy all that was in it and start again. The Second Temple era Book of Jubilees explains that the Nephilim set the evil in motion through their sexual improprieties. Following the flood, the earth is repopulated by Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yafet. From the line of Ham emerged Nimrod. When the latter is introduced, the term Gibor is applied to him no fewer than 3 times within 2 verses. For our purposes, the important point is that Nimrod came to be described in late antique Jewish and Christian sources as Abraham's main adversary, the representation of tyranny and polytheism who sought to kill Abraham and abort his monotheistic revolution. Thus, when the Bible introduces us to Gibors, it associates them with moral corruption so thorough as to warrant a destruction of all civilization and with anti-Abrahamic idolatry and tyranny. Next up, we find Esau, also known as Edom, who is not referred to specifically as a Gibor, but whose descendants, as we shall see, are, and who is unmistakably channeling Nimrod in the biblical text, as scholars have shown. The point about Esau is that he is the foil to his twin Jacob, who, as Israel, is the progenitor of the Israelites. Thus, a moral civilization, monotheism, and the Israelites' progenitor are pitted against Edom's Gevurah from the very outset. At subsequent moments in the biblical narrative, we are again introduced to troublemaking Gibors. When the 12 spies are sent to scout out the promised land, the 10 unbelievers among them return pessimistic, worried about the existence there of the same Nephilim whom we had previously encountered as corruption-spreading Gibors. The point is that these 10 do not believe that they will be able to overcome the Nephilim, despite God's promise. As the story goes, for their slandering of the land and lack of trust in God's ability to defeat the Gibors, the children of Israel were forced to wander in the desert for 40 years. The next major trauma in biblical history is the split between the northern kingdom of Israel from the southern kingdom of Judah. Under whose watch does this Israelite fitna take place? It is none other than Yerovam, who rebelled with the 10 tribes against Rehovam. By now, we should not be surprised to discover that Yerovam too is described as a Gibor. As a final example, we find that in the typical heroic defeat by an unfancied underdog of the disproportionately strong villain, I refer to the David and Goliath story, it is interesting that although in later Hebrew usage, Gibor is used to refer to a hero or champion, in the case of this story, it is not David but Goliath who is referred to by this term. Again, in late antiquity, the rabbis provided the extra detail that Goliath was not merely a battlefield rival of David, but a personification of ungodliness. To summarize thus far, some of the crucial moments of Israelite history, the role of the narrative's villain, or the foil to the Israelite way of life, theology, nation, or representative, was the Gibor. And in the story of the 12 spies, we get a glimpse of the trap into which the Israelites themselves were to fall, namely in lacking in trust of God's ability to defeat such Gibors. While the Bible's major objection to the Gibors is the fact that they are in competition with God for people's support and trust, a competition that God is disappointed to discover he sometimes loses, we also hear of the nations who follow Gibors, which affords us a glimpse into the culture of Gevurah, of which the Bible so thoroughly disproves. Once, in later biblical books, the Gibor culture came to be associated with specific nations, the resolution of our picture sharpens. Hence, we are told that Gibors are associated with excessive wine drinking, their society stresses honor, and they weaponize language and engage in what might be termed verbal jousting against God and his people, bringing to mind the sort of Jahili Muruwwa duels waged by tribal poets. There's a good example of this in Psalm 52, which I won't read out loud now. It is significant that the verbal jousting aspects of Gibor behavior is associated with the Bible specifically with the Edomites. In general, the Edomites, more than any other nation, are associated with the Gibor culture against which the Bible is polemicizing. But there are also aspects of Edomite Gevurah that appear particular to them, such as their jealousy and propensity for vengeance. I can think of 2 reasons why the Edomites specifically came to personify Gibor culture. First, when Jacob and Esau are described in the Bible and their characters contrasted, Jacob is referred to as a man of tents, whereas Esau is a man of hunting. Not only are they national rivals, but their lifestyles are described as being at odds with each other. In other words, the Edomites represent the rival culture or value system to that of the Bible's chosen people. Second, the Edomites, who worshipped the god Kaus, appear to have made relatively frequent use of the root Gabara in their nomenclature. Assyrian inscriptions from the 8th century BCE refer to an Edomite king by the name of Kaus Gabri. The god Kaus is my Gibor. This also having been the name, Latinized as Kostobaros, of Herod's governor of Idumea. Similarly, one of the Edomites' main settlements was the city Etzion Gever. If the biblical God saw himself as the only Gibor, then Edomite theology was leveling a direct challenge to this. To summarize, the Gibor culture against which the Bible polemicizes is characterized by licentiousness, excessive wine consumption, vengeance, an obsession with honor, and intertribal verbal jousting. There is much to admire in such a culture, the physical strength of its warriors and the intellect of their sharp-tongued wise men. The Israelites must not, however, be swayed by these attractions and must rely only on God. Gibor culture is thus also God's direct competitor for the people's trust. Perhaps it goes without saying, but I will say it anyway. The Gibor culture has a striking amount of commonalities with Goldziher's Muruwwa. Our question thus remains, why did Goldziher opt to consider Muruwwa within the comparative context of virtus rather than within that of Gevura? Before seeking to answer this question, I would like to strengthen it by suggesting that at least certain aspects of this Gevura and Din dichotomy were known to the Quran. The borrowed term Jabbar occurs 10 times in the Quran, always with the same connotations as those described in the Bible. The story of the 10 slanderous spies who complained that the land was inhabited by intimidating Nephilim refers in the Quran's version to the Nephilim as Qawm Jabbarin. We knew from Genesis that the Nephilim were Gibors, though they are not described as such in Numbers. The Quran, however, was aware of the association. Similarly, though not Quranic, early Islamic tradition refers to Nimrod as a Jabbar, and the Quran itself, God adopts the epithet Al-Jabbar, just as the biblical God self-identified as the Gibor. Most importantly for my argument, however, are two references to the Jabbar connotations in Surat Maryam, where it is employed as a direct contrast to taqwa, piety. In verses 13 to 14, we are told that John the Baptist was God-fearing and pious towards his parents and was not a Jabbar and rebellious. And in verses 31 and 32, Jesus says that God enjoined upon him prayer and almsgiving for as long as he lived, and piety toward his mother. He has not made me a Jabbar, miserable. In other words, the Jabbar lifestyle is the mirror image of taqwa. Recall that Izutsu and Pokol, in treating the Muruwwa and Din dichotomy, actually opted to replace Din with taqwa. Bearing in mind Goldziher's Orthodox Jewish upbringing, his doctoral thesis on Tanchum Yerushalmi, and his subsequent scholarly pursuits in the field of Hebrew and Jewish studies, it is nigh inconceivable that he was unaware of the Bible's use of the root gabara with a semantic field that is almost identical to that represented by mara'a, and with usages that pitted Israelite monotheism against the ruddy purveyors of Gevura. Why did Goldziher turn towards Roman virtus and away from biblical Gevura? To answer this question, I will limit myself to a rather simple suggestion, which draws on some recent studies of Goldziher's troubled relationship with the field of Jewish studies. Building on the past century of Goldziher studies, we are in a position to understand the evolution of Goldziher's uneasiness with this field. Early on in his scholarly career, Goldziher positioned himself as a defender of Judaism in the face of Renan's view that the Semites were inferior to the Greeks for not having had a mythology of their own. Goldziher thus set out to prove Renan wrong by publishing an entire monograph on the subject in 1876. Interestingly, in his mythology book, Goldziher refers in passing to the existence of Edomite culture in Arabia, mentioning Arabian evidence for the god Qaus. Moreover, on the basis of his diaries, we can determine that Goldziher wrote his mythology book during his Oriental Islamic year, as he called it, and intertwined his study of biblical myth with his understanding of Islam. It would appear, however, that Goldziher abandoned the Jewish angle in something of a huff, both because his mythology book was critiqued harshly in Jewish circles and because he was rejected for a position at the Hungarian Rabbinical Academy, or seminary, who deemed his mythology book to be overly critical of the Jewish tradition. The seminary even barred Goldziher from ever teaching there, the irony for Goldziher being that he wrote the book as a sort of modern-day Josephus to defend Judaism from external criticism. Although Goldziher did eventually land an appointment at the seminary, the intervening years were personally and professionally challenging for him, and his correspondence reflects a full-blown disgust with the Jewish community and even with the field of Jewish studies. Indeed, in Muruwwa and Din, the only biblical reference that Goldziher allowed himself was to the Bilam story, which, as Tamash Turan has pointed out, was in the Torah portion a young Goldziher read at his bar mitzvah. That Goldziher's obvious Jewish problem, as Goitein bluntly put it, influenced his scholarship is apparent from his approach to the origins of Islamic law, as discussed by Patricia Krona. In the introduction to her Roman provincial and Islamic law, she writes, Goldziher was moreover a zealous adherent of the theory of Roman influence on Islamic law. It must, however, be said that his writings on this question are uncharacteristically weak. He postulated large-scale borrowings of Roman concepts on the basis of purely external similarity, disregarded the possibility of transmissions via Jewish law, and had only the most elementary knowledge of the legal system to which he attributed so crucial a role. Krone was so disturbed by this that she turned to it at the end of her book in an appendix devoted to Goldziher on Roman and Islamic law, where she writes, Goldziher was a Jew with an intimate knowledge of Jewish law, who could have made an effortless case for the theory that Jewish law contributed heavily to the Sharia. Yet time and again he opted for the view that it was a bygone stage of Roman legal history which made the contribution. Behind so extraordinary a choice, there must have been personal rather than scholarly factors, and one may speculate that they had to do with his standing in European society. Whereas a preoccupation with Jewish influence on Islamic law simply confirmed him as a Jew, a preoccupation with Roman influence on this law made him an exponent of one of the most prestigious aspects of European civilization. I am inclined to see an exact analogy between Goldziher's decision to focus on the Roman origins of Islamic law rather than the more relevant Jewish ones, and his postulation that virtus, rather than gevurah, was the equivalent of Muruwwa. Zooming out, which I will also do shortly in the more modern sense of the word, and considering our survey of the ideas presented in Muruwwa and Din, it can be said that whereas the various pieces of the puzzle have been brought into sharper focus by developments over a century of scholarship, the picture as a whole has remained fairly clear, and the basic idea underpinning the chapter has weathered remarkably well. This is in stark contrast to some of the recent cutting-edge studies that adopt a hyper-skeptical approach to the sources, which have generally failed to make the transition from the margins to the mainstream of the field. Our attempt to understand Goldziher's complex relationship with Judaism has also benefited from a century of work on Goldziher's life, and may also shed light on the continued relevance to Muruwwa and Din. For although Goldziher was no Orientalist in the Sa'idian sense of the term, he did appear to have a Eurocentric predilection for contextualizing early Islam within classical contexts rather than within those closer to home, such as ancient and late antique Jewish ones. Goldziher's love-hate relationship with Jewish studies seems to have steered him towards virtus and away from gevurah. That virtually all subsequent discussions of Muruwwa that care to compare it to anything choose virtus, thereby following Goldziher's lead, demonstrates quite how influential this study was, and how important, therefore, it is to redress this admittedly small imbalance embedded within it. And if indeed the Muruwwa and Din dichotomy does have biblical DNA, then there are broader implications for our understanding of early Islam than one might think. Neuwirth's groundbreaking idea that the late antique context of the Quran must include not only Judeo-Christian traditions, but also the Jahili traditions of Arabia that contributed either unchanged or as a foil to some Quranic reaction, must take into consideration the possibility that much of what she places in the Jahili pile must in fact join the Judeo-Christian one. There is something thoroughly humbling about studying the great Orientalists of yesteryear, the Wellhausens, the Noldekes, and the Goldzihers, whose work is still read and discussed, and in many cases still considered unsurpassed. Less than a decade ago, for instance, Brill published an English translation of Noldeke's History of the Quran, a book published in 1860 when its author was 24 years old. Wellhausen, still a household name for anyone working on Arabian tribes or the Umayyad Caliphate, is far more famous for his work in biblical studies, which revolutionized one of the most competitive fields within humanities. Goldziher, too, belongs to this group of greats, whose work is soaked in an almost inconceivable erudition and continues to form the very basis of the field. Precisely for this reason, it is important to update his work periodically through critical engagement, as it belongs not behind glass cabinets in museums, but on the shelves and desks of students and scholars alike. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, for this wide-ranging and thought-provoking talk. And if there are any questions, please go ahead.
You started your talk by pointing to the unbridgeable gap between Muruwwa and Din, which is reflected in the essay by Goldziher. But you also mentioned the statement, La Muruwwa, La Dina bila Muruwwa. And this is mentioned in the essay, as far as I remember, right? This is mentioned. So how would you interpret the contradiction between this statement at the beginning about the unbridgeable gap and the quotation of this, I don't remember whether it is a hadith or something else.
Thank you for the question. He does refer to La Din.
Can you raise your voice?
Sorry. Yeah. It's about He does refer to that, I don't know if it's a hadith, La din bila Muruwwa or La din illa bi Muruwwa. But he accepts that what the early generations of Muslims had to do was acculturate aspects of Jahiliyyah values. And something similar happened with virtus in Roman Europe, where with the rise of Christianity, the cardinal virtues of Christianity were acculturated from Roman virtue. But what happens is that basically you're saying that you can still have Muruwwa and Deen as long as you change Muruwwa. So his abridgable gap is about the pre-Islamic Muruwwa and the post-Islamic Deen, and not what happens when they coexist at the same period. But it's a complicated topic. Okay. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for this brilliant talk. I hope that I understood everything. It was so quick. It was really fast forward. But when you talked about Deen and Muruwwa, I didn't hear you say anything about Jahiliyyah and Hilm. And Goldziher wrote about the difference between, and I think that what you talked about masculinity, the Muruwwa masculinity, it reminds me of what Goldziher found in ancient poetry. The Jahil is in fact the barbaric, the male, the alpha male, if you wish, and that the Prophet tried to bring a culture of Hilm. And there's another aspect of Hilm, and when you say about virtues as well, it reminded me of this hadith attributed to, I think it was Abdullah ibn Umar, about the dialogue between Jibril and Muhammad. And one of the three factors or three ingredients of Islam in this hadith, of course, Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. And Ihsan, I think, it's the virtues or the Hilm, if you wish. And another really tiny point is about the prohibition of wine. The Quran, I think, in verse 90 in Surah Al-Ma'idah, indeed doesn't say you are forbidden to drink wine, but in the following verse 91, he says, "Hal antum muntahun?" Will you not be avoiding or prohibiting yourself from drinking wine? The hadith, of course, completes that the people said, "Muntahun, muntahun."
Right. Thank you. Regarding Hilm, sorry, the only one mention I had was that Muawiyah was known for having Hilm. And I think Izutsu, in his book on the ethical concepts of the Quran, does explain how this transferred into Islam. But it's an important point, obviously. About the wine prohibition, you're absolutely right. But again, there are ways of saying this is forbidden. You know, حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ, and this is not used for wine. And if these are Goldziher's two examples of what Deen prohibits, you know, far be it for me to, but it's not the strongest example, especially in light of Shahab Ahmed's book, which focuses dozens, if not hundreds of pages on this precise issue. Because at some point you have to realize that Islam is what Muslims do, as well as what the Quran says, and the Quran doesn't even say categorically not to do it. So it's far from an open and closed case, I think. But thank you for those points.
Yes, please.
I would like to ask another question about the unbridgeable gap, which you argued was not so unbridgeable after all. And that was very convincing. You talked, among other things, about the role of genealogies and boasting of genealogies, must have in a pre-Islamic society, and you said that some of this was carried over to Islam. And you mentioned the regulations about who can become caliph. And as far as I recall, that was the only example that you offered. Now that puts me in mind of the regulations in Islamic law about kafa'ah for marriage partners, because some schools of law actually consider nasab, the equality of nasab and tribal background for that purpose, and in some cases marriages are to this day dissolved on that basis, for instance in Saudi Arabia. So my question is, are there any other examples of the importance of nasab being carried over to Islam from the concept of Muruwwa that you can mention in this context? I would be curious to know about them.
Thank you. So I guess similar to what Ignaz was asking about, I think we have to distinguish between Islam as a practiced religion and Islam's theory. So as a practiced religion, as you say, undoubtedly there are hierarchies, I suppose, but it's not just the caliph, the imam has to be from Quraysh. There's also, obviously, in Shia Islam, the limiting of the lineage to a holy family. Sufis have silsilas. You know, there's this idea, even if it's spiritualized, of not each person. I think Hodgson said, every generation makes its own decisions. And there's this idea that we're actually part of a chain, whether it's a physical, a spiritual, a communal one. We don't start from scratch every time someone is born. And I think that there's a certain, even if the nasab is spiritualized, it's still stressing the importance of having a chain, rather than starting from afresh with each child who's born according to the fitrah. That's how I see it, but perhaps after you can sharpen your points or correct me.
Okay, I see no more questions. So thank you very much, Adam. And